You know, for me personally, I have a hard time considering grunge classic rock. Because to me, it's so different than what, you know, Zeppelin or Aerosmith or even a Motley Crue would sound like.
You couldn't compare Nirvana or Pearl Jam to Aerosmith or Triumph or any of Bon Jovi or any of the bands of the quote-unquote classic hard rock scene.
But I understand that from a radio perspective, it has to move forward, it has to continue.
As the classic rock generation starts to die, which it's happening, as I know classic rock, they have to appeal to yet another audience.
You know, my dad listened to Led Zeppelin and The Doors and Jimi Hendrix. I was like, I want to listen to my own stuff. So I would listen to, you know, Soundgarden, the Foo Fighters, Green Day, Nirvana. And now you put on a classic rock station and you're hearing those bands on classic rock stations now.
You look at these bands that still are guitar-based, driven, heavy, loud rock bands, and that's the Nirvanas and the Pearl Jams and the Alice in Chains, and they are being considered classic rock. Why? Because they're 25 years old or older, or 30 years old. So therefore, the demographic of radio listeners starts to move up, and when those kids were 18, now they're 38, 48 years old. So they would encompass, I would think, demographically the classic rock audience.
The sweet spot in radio advertising is generally between 30 and 50-year-old people. That's the people that have money and jobs and income.
30 to 50-year-old people represent a demographic for in radio as a package, as an age spread.
So when you get beyond that and you become oldies, well, those people tend to be retired, not have as much disposable income. It becomes a little different thing. It's not as appealing.
Radio is a business. Don't ever forget that.
It's interesting because it's the same players over and over and over again. And I keep thinking to myself, how much longer can this sustain itself? Because we are of a time and a period which is determined to be called classic rock. And slowly the promoters are starting to think, how are we going to expand it?
I think that you have to expand because, I mean, I would love to, you know, be able to play, go deep on a lot of classic rock music, but it has to be familiar to people.
So look at it this way. This may sound a little wild, but if you travel stateside or to some other countries, you have the difference between what's called an art gallery and an art museum. A museum to me is a place where you go and you can see the same things from history over and over again. A gallery is a place where you're seeing art that is constantly changing or constantly in development. For classic rock enthusiasts, those who are purists about what classic rock actually is, that's the museum. Whereas radio that brands itself as a classic rock station is more like the gallery, because you're dealing with demographics and what's popular and what the people in that demographic want to listen to. And if they're going to listen to that, it means that certain businesses will want to advertise on those radio stations, and everybody's happy in that mix.
Hey, tri-state area!
I think it's really important that we see the difference between what we accept as classic rock and what we call classics. So a classic, for example, 20 years from today, what we're listening to, what is very popular with people who are listening to music radio, will probably get the term classic applied to it. Whether or not classic rock radio of the future calls that particular music classic rock is not really what's important here. I think the most important thing is that we do understand that there is an era of rock and popular music that is classic rock, that belongs in that classic rock genre, that is complete and different from what classic rock radio plays, trying to meet a demographic.
As programmers, you know, we've been dealing with this problem where if we follow classic rock with the baby boomers to death, we will lose the younger end. So in order to attract the younger end, we need to include at least a portion of the 90s to keep them interested. Because if we attract the younger end with the honey of grunge, they're going to rediscover these unbelievable artists that provided the bedrock for grunge. So, you know, I think we have to sort of widen the scope of classic rock in an effort to attract a broader audience, to keep the format relevant for years to come.
When I'm driving in my car and I listen to a classic rock station, they are playing Nirvana.
Yeah.
They are playing Pearl Jam. And, you know, and I think that's a great thing. But the scary thing is,
we're getting older.
Not just that, but who's gonna be the next, who's gonna be the next wave? Who's gonna be the next people? And I mean, there's a lot of punk rock bands and a lot of bands that kind of we've grown up with, and that are always, there's a huge rock community still alive and very vibrant. But the general overall big rock band, who is it?
It's going to have to be all the bands that came out in the early 2000s. Muse, Rise Against.
I hope so.
I think over time, classic rock has changed. You know, in my opinion, Guns N' Roses is now classic rock. You know, the bands from the 90s have now moved into it. So I honestly don't really know what the pinpoint definition is. But if you ask me who's classic rock, in my opinion, I could tell you who that is.
Nirvana and Smashing Pumpkins and Green Day are now considered part of the classic rock format, even though that it smells a lot newer than classic rock that we all grew up on.
Are they being included now because of the marketing aspect of it? Because literally we need to kind of keep this machine going? Or is it because they sound classic rock? I don't think they sound classic rock. What are your thoughts?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, those bands that are newer, they kind of sound like classic rock because they have all of the things that make those really great bands in the 60s like Zeppelin and The Who and the Beatles work. They use guitars, they are verse, chorus, bridge, verse, chorus, bass. They use real instruments, so there's nothing real electronic that are used for them. So in an aesthetic movement, it's still rock.
You know, if you got a kid like me who grew up in the 90s and you're listening to Nirvana, you turn on a classic rock station now, you're going to hear Nirvana. It's not your dad's music anymore, it's your music. So I feel like classic rock, you know, even though the songs are older, they're still continuing to bring out new songs in the classic rock format because the bands that we loved as a kid are now getting older and becoming classic rock. It's funny, I used to work at a classic rock station, specifically just classic rock, and I had a guest on one day, and he asked me on the radio live, he goes, what is classic rock? What is classic rock to you? And I panicked because classic rock is so many different things to so many different people. And I remember when I got hired at that station, my boss said to me, she goes, do you know what classic rock is? I said, what is classic rock? And she's like, well, it's music that's been around for 20 years or more. And I'm thinking to myself, but that's such a broad spectrum of things. Music 20 years or more, but to me, it's music that's been around 20 years or more that has kind of stood the test of time. You know, you got a song that was written 20 years ago, and you get the same feeling today that you heard when you first heard it. I've heard Three Doors Down, Kryptonite on classic rock stations before, and I'm thinking to myself, why would Three Doors Down be on a classic rock station? But then, you know, people could bring up, why is Green Day on a classic rock station? Because it doesn't have that classic rock feel. But I think, you know, if you're an artist and you're writing a song and it's released on Thursday and you want people on Thursday to like that song, you know, it might be tired out by a week from that Thursday or a year from that Thursday. But if it's still a hit, you know, 25, 35, 45 years later, to me, regardless of the classic rock sound, that's a classic rock song.
You listen to, like, Eddie Vedder inducted the Ramones into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and did like a big speech for them, you know, and they are like a grunge, quote unquote, hard rock band, but they were affected by the Pistols.
All those grunge bands were affected by the punk rock scene.
And like the Ramones and the
Buzz
Clash.
Pixies.
Yeah, absolutely. It all, but that's what I was saying, you know, earlier on. It's like, there are so many offshoots now, there are so many extensions where everything touches it now.
I think the reason why those bands are now getting into that classic rock format or being put in the classic rock format, it's all the same. It's nostalgia. It's the music that we grew up on, and it's the the making of the memories that we all have. That one song can make you easily remember everything, just like the one song can make you forget everything. And when you have mid 30s to mid 40-year-olds who grew up on Led Zeppelin and The Who and the Beatles and that kind of classic rock, mixing with the music that you remember firsthand, it brings a series of memories and nostalgia to the picture. And once you're attached emotionally to the music, then that's perfect for the advertisers to come after you.
A lot of classic rock stations are now calling grunge classic rock. Does that sit well with you?
I really don't care. I mean, they have a job to do as a radio station.
Personally, I'm a classic rock guy. I grew up with the music. I remember listening to Light My Fire for the very first time at, age 10 or 11. But over the years, I've become a music ecologist, and I like new music, and I like classic rock as well. So the blend for me was perfect, because I can never get bored of playing the Zeppelins and the Stones, but in a radio situation that could happen because you're only playing certain songs. For example, Zeppelin Stairway to Heaven. Everybody can say that's been in radio and rock radio has played that probably 10,000 times. So to play a Smashing Pumpkins or a Green Day, to me it freshens up everything else that I'm listening to. The one discussion I've had with people is that I'm afraid that classic rock is becoming an oldies format. And as far as time goes, I think that a lot of radio stations that are geared towards the older generation, that like to listen to the Frank Sinatras and the older music, that's kind of going the way of the dinosaur. And classic rock is going to be our oldies format, if that makes sense.
That actually leads into something I was going to ask you. The general public, what has been their reaction since Q107 has expanded its musical library?
The reaction of fans has been 50-50. I think that the real hardcore classic rock listeners were very disappointed that we were now playing the Green Days and the Audio Slaves and that kind of stuff, and sort of straying away from the Who and the Rolling Stones and Led Zeppelin. But on the other hand, there's also the population that does like a variety of music, and I really think that Q107 is doing a good job with the new and the old, blending it. But there was disappointment. There's no doubt about that. I mean, you can look at the texts, and people still say, why are you playing Alanis Morissette? Well, the woman sold, millions of records, and she is popular. Just because, one radio listener doesn't like her music doesn't mean that we're not going to play it.
Classic rock is the soundtrack of your youth. And to define it by era, I think, is difficult, because as time continues, even with the advent of grunge in the 90s, it was fed by the quality of the music of the 70s. The 70s was the core of classic rock, no question, from 68 to 79. And I'm a massive fan of bands dating back to the starting with the Beatles, obviously, right through to the grunge period. I think without classic rock you wouldn't have had grunge. So I think to start to include grunge in the classic rock vault is important.
For me, classic rock is not evolving, but that's where I grew up. So for me, it's the classic stuff, 70s, To me, 60s rock is like 60s or the British Invasion stuff. So you got the Stones and the Kinks and the Who and the Beatles and all that. I think it is the term, as far as radio stations are concerned, yeah, it's evolving because it's rock and it's classic, but classic to who? So classic to someone born in the 70s like me, yeah, that's Aerosmith and maybe Cheap Trick's right on the edge of that, but for me it's like more in the early 70s, but if someone was born in 1980 or born in 1990, classic rock for them eventually will be out of what, Nickelback, you know? So it's rock that's classic, you know what I mean? So, because we don't think of Elvis as classic rock, he's 50s rock, but maybe if you were born in 1940, the 50s would be like that classic rock thing, you know what I mean? And Aerosmith would be some new thing that you're not familiar with. So, yeah. So, yeah, I think it is probably evolving as far as the radio stations are concerned. And I think it's, you know, the reason the classic rock stations work is because there's people that grew up on that music and that gives them a certain feeling. And so when they hear those tunes, it gives them that feeling again, you know? And so that's why that works. But as those people get into probably like their 50s and maybe going into their 60s even, maybe they're not listening to radio as much, so they want to have a younger audience, and so you got people that maybe grew up on STP or Nirvana and that kind of stuff, and so they're going to want to hear that because that reminds them of their childhood, you know, whereas hearing, you know, American Band by Grand Funk may mean nothing.
So how do you feel about radio stations playing grunge bands and alternative rock bands within classic rock nowadays?
That's interesting because, you know, for a person of my vintage, my particular age, you know, grunge was like new stuff at one point, and for it to be, you know, kind of lumped in with classic rock, but you know, that's the telescopic aspect of looking at not just music but anything, and you know, historically that it's kind of like gets, you know, the farther away from events they get, then the more distant ones, they look a lot closer together than they once might have seemed.
How would you personally define classic rock?
Classic rock is more than a feeling and smells like teen spirit. It gives, you know, classic rock was born out of a marketing format. It was a radio format that came out of AOR radio, which was just kind of album rock radio. And the powers that be, and people much smarter than I am when it comes to radio, decided that there was a whole segment of population, primarily males 25 to 34, 35 years old, that wasn't having their needs met by the new music that was being played. They just didn't feel it. So they designed this format in various parts of the US to create classic rock radio. And it was the music that they grew up on. I mean, I'm in my mid-40s, so I remember oldies stations were playing Elvis and the Beatles, and they stopped at 1974. And that was it. And they didn't play anything current. But in the 80s, something happened where the format started to become a little bit more popular, I think as a segment of the population who didn't grow up on MTV and Much Music and who was looking for the music of their youth, started gearing themselves towards classic rock radio, which was to them and still is to a great deal of people the music of Boston, Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, Van Halen, Pink Floyd, Aerosmith, Tom Petty. Those were the bands that were being played at the time when classic rock radio started, and those still are the biggest bands on classic rock radio. Wow. In fact, the top 5 bands, which are Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, Tom Petty, Pink Floyd, and the Rolling Stones, make up 15% of all the songs on classic rock radio today. The top 10 bands, which includes ZZ Top and the Beatles and Boston, those bands make up 25% of the music. So there's still a small segment of population when it comes to the bands getting a lot of the spins. And to me, that's what classic rock is up until the last couple of years, where radio formats started going a little bit closer to the present, and now they're playing a lot of 90s music.
You also, as a radio station, have to kind of have an idea of who you're catering to and talk to those people specifically, who your target audience is. Ours is, you know, a male between the ages of, you know, 38 and 45, and, you know, the music that you grow up with is the most important to you, whether you grew up in the 60s or 70s, you know, Stones, Beatles, Zeppelin, Floyd, or if you grew up in the 90s, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Smashing Pumpkins, Sloan. And I think that what Q107 has done is just kind of, you know, broaden that sort of scope to incorporate music. I think if you're a rock music fan, whether it be classic rock or otherwise, the changes are good for you. You're not listening to the same Rolling Stones songs and the same Zeppelin songs. You're getting a mixture of rock. Same kind of thing where when people ask me, is Toronto a hockey town? It's not. It's a Maple Leaf town. We care about our Maple Leafs. The Marlies usually have nobody in there. So if you're a music fan, then you like the changes that have happened here at Q107.
Very cool. And do you feel that there could be, because like a lot of people say that Guns N' Roses in particular is the last great hard rock band. Do you feel that there could ever be another band as prolific as a Guns N' Roses or an Aerosmith in this new field of music where classic rock is not as loved anymore, so to speak?
I think everything is cyclical, like the whole pop-punk movement of the early 90s and the grunge movement and whatnot, where, on the MTV Music Awards, you had Poison and Nirvana playing on the same show, and you could tell that it was the end of hair metal at that time. It's made a resurgence now. It's all cyclical. Do I think it can happen again? 100%. I think it's up to people who want to hear something different than the everyday. Guns N' Roses, Black Crowes, their first two albums, a lot of people thought that those guys would be the next band to kind of like take the mantle. But do I think could be another band? You could say U2 is that band now, but they've been around since the late 70s, early 80s. For sure, I think it can happen. It's just a matter of when.
Nirvana and those bands, they had a lot of good offerings. I'm not saying they were bad bands or anything. It's a lot better than what's out there now. But different kind of music. It's classic in the sense that there were big hits and big bands. So they fit.
Do you think just the sound-wise, just as far as the sound's concerned, do you think that it fits the mold of like the blues-based classic rock, or is it a separate thing? Complicated question, I know.
It is. I would say it's a separate thing. It's sure blues-based, but from an audio dynamics point of view and a chord change point of view and a playing point of view, it's different. And I liked it because it was different. At first I went, oh, what's that? And then I got into it and went, wow, that's not so bad, because those guys could play. And that was the key for me, that a great band with great songs and great players is going to be a great band, without question. So if you look at the Nirvanas and the Pearl Jams and all the Seattle-based bands that came out, those were good bands. There wasn't a bad one among them, in my mind. They were all good bands. It's just a question they were playing a different style of music.
When Q107 rebranded itself, what was the reaction from the fans?
The reaction of the fans when we switched to Toronto's Rock Q107, I think mostly was refreshing. We got a lot of text. It was mixed. Some people weren't happy. Nobody likes to have things that they've been comfortable with for a number of years to have it yanked out. But, at the time, if you want to call them new tracks that we have introduced to the playlist, 2 or 3 were being played an hour compared to the 10 that you would hear that you would be familiar with. So kind of like in my first answer, when people say, is Toronto a hockey town? No, we're a Maple Leaf town. So if you are a music fan, then what has happened here is good for you. And, we haven't gone so far off the beaten path. We're not playing Cyndi Lauper, right? We've added, the Sheepdogs. We've added Pearl Jam, Nirvana, these bands that have, I hate to tell you, have had albums that have been out for over 20 years now. The Black Keys, tons of different bands that if you are a true music fan and a true rock music fan, that these will be, should be embraced.
We rebranded the radio station Toronto's Rock from Classic Rock for a number of reasons, but basically the music that we played, the true classic rock by, I guess, old definitions, was getting a bit tired, and it needed to evolve, it needed to expand, and we're really not the people who are defining what the radio station is musically. It's kind of what the listeners deem to be classic rock or rock. And I'll give you an example, like a Nirvana or a Pearl Jam, Foo Fighters wouldn't have been considered classic rock years ago. But these records, some of them are 20, 30 years old, and they now fit the definition of classic rock as the definition, the listener's definition of classic rock, if you will. So, the reason for rebranding, survival. We need to evolve the radio station to be more in tune with what our listeners want. The main reason, ratings. Our audience is getting older. We still need to live in an adult 25-34 arena, and to get them, we need to adjust the sound of the radio station and adjust the music.
Okay, so you mentioned that you feel that these new bands now fit what classic
New
rock
bands,
is.
they're new to us.
Yeah, no, that's
I love
what.
it.
Yeah, I know. To the old school classic rock listeners.
We actually did a marketing campaign that said, "Have you heard of these new bands, Foo Fighters and Pearl Jam and Nirvana?" And we, poking fun at ourselves, very tongue in cheek. But it's funny. That's new music to this radio station. It's funny.
Recently, in the past few years, classic rock stations have been expanding their playlist to include music from the 90s and 2000s.
Well, I think that they have to go with the times. As people get, the new people that get older, they're going to have to cater to them. So the 90s stuff, 80s stuff had to become classic. 90s stuff is going to have to become classic. So they what they probably do is get a new program director, and the radio stations have to up it a notch, So anything, anything could be classic rock as long as it's good. And I think that if you just keep playing the same 70s stuff forever, then when do you become oldies?
Like, are we considered classic rock? If we started 22 years ago, and there's a lot of our fans who are a lot younger than 22.
I think it would have to determine on when our first
like
major
the first
release
single
would be.
Okay, because it's easy to go to the Zeppelins and to the Sabbaths as classic rock, because those were I'd hang my hat on those two bands as being like the quintessential classic rock bands.
Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, you were more into Floyd than I was. You and Ian, especially.
Yeah. I guess. But you're right, though, because synthesizers and all that change it, because there's bands from the 70s and 80s that are definitely not classic rock, that are maybe kind of rock bands, like Depeche Mode in a way, but that's more electronic music that I wouldn't consider a classic rock, but they're a classic band.
They're an iconic band, and same with like the bands like 9 Inch Nails and things like that when they came out and what they were doing. But that's the thing, is that music, much like you said, or from your point of view, and to which I agree to for the most part, is blues is where most of rock music originated from, right? So from blues transformed into this beautiful other kind of medium.
Mm-hmm.
And then from that, though, it's accelerated and has branched off into all these different offshoots, And that inspired all of us to pick up a bass or to, get demoted to singing.
Well, maybe we
I was
should.
the drummer, and then I got
Maybe we should just roll the cameras and.
Oh, they're rolling.
Oh, they're rolling.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is
I thought
This is real talk. I'm making
what classic rock still was.
And then for me, a band like Jane's Addiction changed my whole life, because in 1988, my brother came in and was like, "Here, listen to this," and it floored me, because at that time it was a lot of like the Warrants and the Poisons and the She's My Cherry Pie.
And I would say Jane's Addiction would be more of a nod to classic rock than anything else that was going on around, because they had a lot of the psychedelic kind of vibe to it.
And weird rhythmic things and solos, and Dave Navarro was like a bit of a, but not just a shredder to
but
be
Jane
a shredder.
says could be like a Grateful Dead tune.
This is my point then.
Mm-hmm.
So classic rock to us, we've been able to originally grow up in the Zeppelins and the Sabbaths and the Floyds, and then now being of a certain age, we've been part of the second wave of classic rock, which is now classic rock.
To go back to your future classic bands, future classic rock bands. Well, there's some in the making right now. I mean, Foo Fighters. I mean, every time you look up a tweet, anytime you look up rock news, even go to the classic rock forums, David Grohl's doing something that's just incredibly rock and roll attitude. He breaks his foot on stage. He plays it right up. He goes, "Yeah, man, I'm just going to keep playing." That's rock and roll. Rock and roll also has always been about rebellion. It's always been against the grain, right back to the blues roots. You know, Chuck Berry, My Ding-a-Ling. I mean, people go on the, you hear that on the radio in the 50s, and you go, whoa, you can't, that's, you know, like he's singing about, you know, that's My Ding-a-Ling. Rock and roll's always been about that. You got the Stones, they've always, you know, they had blues roots. There's many songs you can't play of the Rolling Stones on the radio. That's the rock and roll attitude. David Grohl goes up on stage, breaks a foot, keeps going with the show. You know, he brings people up from the audience, has them play. You know, he might use language, but that's rock and roll again. The attitude is right there. It's not just a sound. Classic rock is not just a sound. It's a genre and it's an attitude, and it's right there. And it comes right out of your speakers, right at you every single time. There's no such thing as rock and roll that behaves.
Well, I can't encapsulate. I can't even say why the industry does what it does. I can't explain why classic rock radio doesn't play stuff by guys like me who are putting on better albums than I've ever put out. My Heavy Blues album is some of the best stuff I've done, jammed live off the floor. Well, got a new band, a female drummer and a bass player, and we just went nuts in the studio, did everything in the first or second take, and you could sense the great vibe and feel of us sweating and perspiring in the studio like it was a club, a Saturday night jam at a club. That often doesn't happen. It's somebody sitting at a computer and everything is just metronomic and right in beat and everything's pitch corrected. On this album that's full of mistakes and I'm singing off key and off pitch and we just left it because it was charming is kind of the word, or real or natural. So I can't explain why the industry does that. I can't explain why classic rock radio doesn't play the classic rock artists anymore, even on a featured show on a Saturday night or a Sunday night, or play 2 for 1. Here's Bowie then, here's Bowie now. Here's Mark Bolan now, or here's Tears for Fears, and here's Orland now with his new band. And give us a shot, because we're still out there touring. We're making more money than ever. We're still playing live. And the radio stations could actually promote us like they did in the old days and have Classic Rock Fest, which is what Classic Rock Magazine does in England. They own the market. There's Classic Rock Magazine, they own Classic Rock Radio. They've now expanded to progressive rock, country rock, vintage rock. They have all these festivals all over. They have their own couple of radio stations that play this music, and the fans are in the millions and legions, and they're building and holding on to careers. I want to go move to England.
Yeah, but then you might actually get mixed up with The Who if you go to England, right?
No, Pete Townshend's doing what he's doing. We all have new records out. Give them a listen. I heard a new track by Aerosmith, it blew me away. I heard a new Stones, it blew me away. I heard a Neil Young, it blew me away. In England, I heard, oh my God, Tears for Fears, Bernie Marsden, Whitesnake. Everybody's back. The survivors have survived. They're making great music. Give us a shot. Play 2 for 1. Play an old one and a new one. You'll change the world. Radio could be the new radio instead of internet being the new radio.
Awesome.
There's my thoughts.
Well, fortunately right now for us, classic hits music is doing quite well right across North America. So we're kind of in a golden period. I don't exactly know the secret formula why, but I have a few thoughts. Vinyl has made a comeback, and I'm thinking, a lot of kids, you go to the Value Village, the Goodwill stores, the secondhand stores, and you'll see younger generations picking out the vinyl. And I've actually been in a spot where I'm kind of like, is he going to take that thing? I hope not. But I think it's because they're rediscovering all of the greatness that came with listening and sitting back and experiencing vinyl. And in the same process, discovering how awesome it was. So I think that's had a little bit to do with it. I think commercial advertisement, again, is responsible for the resurgence of it. A lot of 80s movies, Hot Tub Time Machine, just to throw reference to that, they go back to the 80s. And I think it's and the other thing is the sampling that a lot of the new music does also channels the 80s music. So people are hearing these things, Glee, for example, they're watching the show and then the parents are going, no, that's not a new song. That's an old song, as a matter of fact, and then the parents would, let the kids experience that music in its original state, and with any luck, the kids are going, wow, this really is good. Glee isn't on the air anymore, but we're still playing the music that they featured in the show. So I think there's a few factors that are making it cool again. Everything, makes its circles, makes its comebacks, and right now 80s and 70s, 80s, 90s music is doing that for at least Boom 97.3 in Toronto, so thank goodness. for the most part, the 80s music, a lot of people wanted to try something new, be different, hence some of the freaky hairdos that you'd see, hair bands, you name it, different clothes, wild. Everybody wanted to stand out and be absolutely different. Ziggy Stardust, for example, I know that's 70s, but you know, you had to find that niche to try and be different to make sure you make an impression. MTV was big as well because that gave bands a venue to say, this is who we are, check us out, let's be wild, let's be crazy. A lot of the time, people just shot shit that had nothing to do with the video whatsoever, but they just wanted to be outlandish and memorable. And yeah, MTV certainly survived for a little while, but then, you know, like most things, they evolved. So it was a lot of, let's be different, let's stand out, let's see what we can do that nobody else has done before, and make it our own.
How would you define classic rock? Like, what is classic rock? Very open-ended question.
Great. What is classic rock? Wow. It's a great question. I guess classic rock is defined as, you know, music from, you know, the 1960s to the, you know, late 1980s. And we have a show on Q107 called Psychedelic Sunday, which is 65 to 75, which is right that classic rock wheelhouse. I guess it would just be defined by those classic rock bands that paved the way for all the stuff, you know, that I grew up with in the early 90s. The Zeppelins, the Beatles, the Stones, you know, Pink Floyd. That's classic rock. Is classic rock a sound more than it is sort of like a stereotype? Maybe. I spoke with the Black Crowes. Were they classic rock? They had that sort of southern rock sort of sound. But to kind of bottle and define what classic rock is, I think is very hard, and people who are smarter and more literate than I could be able to tell you what classic rock is. For me, classic rock, you know, is more of a feeling, you know, music that moves you and you feel it inside, and, you know, music with soul, which is why I think that, you know, bands that we play now, like the Smashing Pumpkins, STP, Nirvana, the Black Keys, Kings of Leon, they all have music with soul in it, and you can feel it. And I think that's why that music stands out and why it can be so easily put into our playlist. But to define classic rock, I guess if you had to do it, it would just kind of be a snapshot of time.
What were we going to say?
Yeah, so, you know, you were saying that these bands now fit what is considered classic rock. So the name of the film is called What is Classic Rock? How would you, and it's a very open-ended question, but how would you define classic rock?
My definition of classic rock is music that's built to last, that will stand the test of time, not disposable pop. That's basically what it, if it rocks and then it's got legs and it'll last, the chances are it'll live in the classic rock arena.
Mm-hmm. So classic rock, in your opinion, would, I guess, not be then a specific type of genre?
Sure, it is. I think programmers tend to put it into those buckets, and that's where classic rock as a format is evolving. It's evolving beyond what programmers deemed it to be, which was 60s, 70s, maybe a little sprinkling of the 80s, but it's evolving beyond that now.
Mm-hmm.
And listeners are the ones that are determining what is classic. We'll do music tests a number of times a year, and we'll test a massive amount of music to get a sense of what fits the classic rock definition. And we get back songs that we thought might not fit, but they've told us, you know, on crowdsourced music testing that we do, that this song works for what we think is Q107. I think that classic rock definitely is the differentiation between the disposable pop and classic rock and good rock is that it's authentic.
Now that, I guess, classic rock is expanding as far as what it stands for, you know, like you said, Foo Fighters is now considered classic rock in many genre circles, so are Pearl Jam and Nirvana. Oftentimes people say that Guns N' Roses, in particular, is the last great hard rock band. They're the last great classic rock band to ever be around. Do you think that a band like that could ever resurface to the level that they were at, considering that sort of music in particular is no longer, like, loved as much in the younger circles?
No, I don't think so. I think rock is a niche. You know, it's a pretty wide niche, but it's a niche format, and we're living in a pop world, and I think to get a rock band to that level, that stature, I don't think it'll happen. It may happen, but I don't think it will, in my opinion, in the foreseeable future.
No, I don't think classic rock's losing its appeal. I think that, it could stand on its own, but I think with everything, the times change.
You know, everything in this day and age is created on a keyboard and a drum machine, and the vocals are treated beyond belief in Pro Tools, and these guys from the 70s were all quality musicians. You did not have success unless you were a player, and I think the art of musicianship is being lost in today's music, and so do I hope we return to a guitar-based drums, vocals, musical society? I sure as hell hope so, yes. My personality is shaped by the music of that time. And you know, everybody goes through sort of a phase. They discover it in phases. I started, listening to Led Zeppelin and the Doors, and then I moved into the sort of the folkier stuff and the Crosby, Stills and Nash and the Neil Young, and so there's so much meat to it that it's so impossible to describe it as one possible thing. I think classic rock will stand the test of time because the albums of that age, people listen to the entire product. And when they were creating the music, they spent an incredible amount of time creating them. And I don't think that the same sort of effort is put into creating an album of work as happened back in the day. I think, these bands, the Led Zeppelins, the Doors, the Eagles, the Beatles, created bodies of work in their entirety. Now it's a singles-based mentality, and I just don't think it's going to stand up to the classic rock of the 70s. It's actually interesting, even in radio ratings, we find that there's a sort of a classic rock saddle, we call it, from ages sort of 25 to 44, where people sort of lose interest in it. But 18 to 25, we find the kids are discovering for the first time, and they're getting charged up by the Zeppelins, the Doors, the Eagles, etc. And so, without including grunge, we're not going to have the honey to attract the younger bees.
In my outlook on the music, it really kind of extends itself into the mid-70s and then kind of dies off after that. As soon as the progressive movement starts to fizzle out, that's, for me, where classic rock technically kind of slows down. Because I think as a complete genre, production-wise, musicianship-wise, creativity, everything then was kind of mostly blues-based. Even if you listen to a lot of even Genesis and Yes, you listen to a lot of the things they were doing, those were still steeped in some kind of a blues motif, even though they kind of took it a little further out and they introduced elements of jazz and esoterica into what they're writing. I kind of came up in the mid-'80s, and looking back at a lot of the music that started from, like, let's say, well, I guess you could say Bruce Springsteen and
pre-'80s
Boston,
Bruce,
right?
That's
still at the tail of the 70s. It really doesn't. I mean, even though they carried over into that, as far as the sound of classic rock, what we expect to hear, the production of classic rock, it kind of still lives in the 70s. To me, it doesn't really extend itself.
And that's exactly the way I feel it. But I think it's the generation too. When you were born and the demographics of your music, and to me, the 80s is not classic rock. It kind of, maybe that was because it was my generation of actually starting to really play in bands and playing out live and creating my own music. So for me, classic rock has always been 60s.
Classic rock, the term classic rock is an era. It's the 1970s, really, for me. And that era of music will live forever, we'll hear it forever, and it's never going away. They wrote some of the greatest songs, the greatest records, amazing production. It's there forever. Once the 80s and the 90s hit, you had very specific sounding production on certain things, and songwriting changed, and I think record labels got a lot more involved in that process. So for me, classic rock is that era of the 70s. You know, that's the magic time when all the great records, all the great songs, all the great production happened. It will last forever. They're going to play it for the next 100 years. After that, I think, is when it changes. 80s, 90s, up till now. There's certain things that are going to squeak through, but I just don't see a lot of the current artists lasting like they did. And songwriting has a huge part to do with it. There's just, it's not, the quality just isn't there. I just think that the classic rock era from the 60s and 70s is going to last forever. And those songs will never go away. I still listen to them all the time. I listen to lots of new music too, but I'll always listen to that music. It's what I grew up listening to, and it's the greatest songs ever written.
But you know, on the subject of classic rock generally, there's a spirit and an energy to the 70s, and it's infused in those records that were made at that time, and nothing else sounds like that. You know, every decade has its own sound, and the 70s has that sound that just feels good. I mean, think of 70s, Have a Nice Day, and the smiley face. You know, the 80s was a bit more of a kind of self-indulgent, serious thing, and then the 90s was, you know, depression and, you know, flannel shirts and that whole. I mean, a lot of those singers from those bands are dead. You know, I would say more so than the ones from the 70s, and those guys are older. You know, but it's just, it was a different mindset, it was a different energy and different attitude. So I think when you hear like More Than a Feeling by Boston, it just has it in there, you know. So even if you're familiar with that tune or not from your childhood, it just has a certain feeling, as it were, you know, that the 80s don't have and the 90s don't have. So I think, again, like logistically for radio stations, yeah, classic rock is evolving, because if it's classic to you, then that depends on when you were born. But for me, classic rock, no, it has a classic feeling, you know. It's a different thing. It's pre-click track, certainly pre-auto-tuning and fixing stuff.
In your mind, what's the timeline of classic rock?
I don't think classic rock is over. It's even hard to define. You know, and I think everybody's got a different viewpoint of what classic rock is. If you use me as a basis of classic rock, means you're based in the origins of rock and roll, which is the Chuck Berrys, the Little Richards, the Jerry Lee Lewis. You're based in that, and you've turned it into something contemporary. So you have to start with that blueprint. Here we go again. That's the blueprint. If you have that in your repertoire, then you're classic rock, yes. It's guitar motivated, for sure. Guitar riff motivated, and it's got a very, very strong bass and drum line in it that plays together. That's your classics. It's not too many chords, you know. It's kept simple but heavy. Classic rock embodies the basic ingredients of rock and roll, which is your blueprint laid down by Chuck Berry, Jerry Lee Lewis, Little Richard. It exploits a sexuality, has no boundaries, so you can let it all out with rock and roll. It makes you think, it makes you feel, but at the same time, rock and roll, if it's good rock and roll, can just take you into another sphere that you don't even have to think at all. You can just fly with it. Good rock and roll will transport you.
So Jim, as a director here at Y108, what are your thoughts about the evolution of classic rock? Is it evolving?
I do think the evolution of classic rock continues. You have to have new bands that are coming along that are reintroducing themselves as classics. To say that classic rock ended in '82 is foolhardy, because you have to have these bands that are conveying a new message, right? I think a classic rock band is one that has a powerful message at the right time, that is surrounded by a aura that is larger than the band itself. So you have personalities, you have characters in it that tell stories outside of the music, you have powerful music speaking to a group of people at the right time, and you have a good group of players that can convey it musically so it's of interest for a number of years. And if it really touches a lot of people and a large group of people at the right time, then it could become a classic.
Our station format, we have 70s, 80s, 90s. We play artists from the 90s that are similar to some of the sounds from the 70s and 80s. Oasis, for example, Nirvana.
They've got that the rootsy kind of vibe, that feel, that freedom, that energy, that talent, the songwriting process. So I think, yes, it's just a matter of the listener evolving, you know. You've got somebody that grew up listening to 70s music. They're getting older, but, you know, hey, I still like those guys.
How did Tom Scholz record More Than a Feeling?
A great example of a studio album, and one that changed the music industry, was Boston and More Than a Feeling. And it's one guy in a studio layering and layering and layering. I think there's like 7 guitars that he's got on the album, and then and the drums and all of that nonsense. But it sounds fantastic, and it was that album that made other groups like Foreigner, like Journey, go, holy shit, look what this guy can do. We got to do that. It was kind of he created a new formula. But it was just one guy in a studio doing it the old school way. Lost are the days where you get a bunch of people in a studio, in a house, or wherever the place may be, that are recording an album. You know, it was a community sort of vibe. You'd be locked in this place for days trying to pump out some stuff. As frustrating as it is that I hear from artists when they talk about that, it's also kind of a lost art now, in that you can just record your little bit, leave, and that stuff's saved on a hard drive somewhere. So, you know, it's handy in an editing kind of way. You don't have to, live there for a month or 2 months or however long it takes. You can just record your piece and then scoot. So, I think the computer technology is good, and it's also kind of takes away from the whole experience, that whole lost roots of creating an album, a classic album. I think there's a big positive to the internet. It's exposure. It's like free marketing. Somebody wants to know, hey, what was that song by The Who? Or what was that song by Led Zeppelin that I heard on that TV show? You go to the internet and you look up the episode, you find out what the soundtrack was, or so on and so forth, or movie soundtracks. So it opens up a whole new era, of potential buyers. And with the amount of commercials that are using songs that we're familiar with, Lord knows how many times I've said, where have I heard that song before? There it is. Oh, it's those guys. Chorus. So it's a great marketing tool if you're a band of any genre.
Could a band exist today that was like Guns N' Roses and Aerosmith? I think so. I think what a band should do would be to study the classics, to study what these bands did and how they pulled it off, on stage as well as outside of the stage. What were their quirks? What did they do to essentially piss off the media or give the fans, have them wanting more? I think if a band, obviously they have to be talented musicians, they got to write, they got to produce, they got to own all their stuff. And then if they can study the classic rockers and the ones that they really, really look up to, I think, they could possibly pull it off. But there's so many different factors now today. You've got social media, you've got obviously different styles of radio stations coming up rather than your regular AM and FMs. You've got your online radio stations now, so they need to find a way. There's a lot of studying. They would take every ounce of that media exposure and use it to their advantage and create something mythical, if you will. So I think they could. It's just a matter of who's it going to be and when's it going to happen.
Do you think that there could be another Led Zeppelin for the new generation? What would they have to do?
I think there is. That's tough. That's a tough question, though. Led Zeppelin was Jimmy Page's brainchild. Here's this session player who, was kicking ass and everybody was bringing him in. And he said, I'm tired of doing what everybody else wants to do. I want to do what I want to do. So you need somebody that's going to, have that genesis of a thought and go, you know what, let's make a kick-ass. Let's do some research. Let's figure out what made these guys successful, or what did these guys. You can take all these different elements of different successful rock bands, and of course passion is a huge part of that, and talent and timing. So if you can market yourself and get enough people and passion and support, then I think totally you could do it. There isn't really any good super groups that are still around, with the exception maybe of U2, Rolling Stones obviously, but they're getting older. So, who is going to be that super group? Classic rock has so many different influences on it. You know, it's got the country vibe, Leonard Skinner. It's got the bluesy vibe, Led Zeppelin. It's got the hard rock kind of punky feel, which is the Who. So it's got so many different elements in it.
I would define classic rock as the foundation of modern rock music. I mean, it's pretty funny working in a classic rock station. I was born in 1990. I'm 25 years old. And, you know, at the height of the careers of the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, I didn't even exist yet. So, I mean, that in itself speaks volumes. And I think that, you know, every band draws inspiration from what presides before them or precedes them. So, you know, like before classic rock, in the 50s, there was Elvis Presley, Ike Turner, Jerry Lee Lewis, and everything builds. And I think, you know, classic rock has that solid foundation. I also think that, you know, people want to believe in something. And classic rock, to me, it has that connection to historic moments. It's so ingrained into our pop culture. I mean, you know, you ask anyone, I guarantee you ask anyone, they'll know a classic rock song. They may not know the band's name, they may not know the title, but you have Hotel California, the Eagles come on, or you have Queen Bohemian Rhapsody, and it's so ingrained into films and to television shows. It's so involved into our pop culture, and I think that's what gives its longevity, and I think that's why it has lasted and why it continues to last.
So speaking about its longevity, a lot of people would argue that classic rock is an oldies genre now that is kind of dying off. It needs to lean on modern music to survive. What do you say to those people?
I think they're wrong. I mean, like I said, it speaks volumes for me anyways, as someone who's, again, 25 years old, and I still look and draw inspiration from these bands, you know, from the Ramones, from the Beatles, the Sex Pistols. All of these bands help build and give that creative inspiration to the modern rock that we see today. I mean, you sit down with any modern band and they'll tell you, you ask them, where do you draw your inspiration from? Like, what made you want to play guitar? Who do you want to sound like? And oftentimes they're gonna drop the classic rock band name. So I think that, you know, it's paved a path in music. It's an awesome path, and it's an outlet for people, you know, aside from the typical music that you'd hear. Like nowadays there's tons of collaborations, tons of genres mixed into one song, and I think classic rock, it kind of has that raw, authentic sound that gives people a clear reminder of the authentic bass, the guitar, the vocals, and I just think that it's an amazing outlet for musicians. It speaks to the masses. I mean, these people grew up listening to classic rock, but then you have, you know, someone in the age demographic of 25 plus or in the 20 range, and they're still listening to that music because, like I said, everything builds, and it comes from that music from before, from classic rock. So, for instance, you know, you have the classic rock, you have the 90s punk genre, subgenre, and that's all mixed into Y108. And I think people are very accepting of that because it's the modern rock that we do play. It's all inspired from that classic rock. So, you know, it's also a very proud thing for Hamilton to have such big names like the Arkells and Monster Truck that we spin on Y108s. And like I said before, you ask any of these bands, you sit down with them, and their inspiration comes from those previous classic rock bands, or even well before that in the 50s.
Very cool. Now, I just want to ask you, we're just going to wrap up here. I just want to ask you the first question again, just because I want to get it with a different angle here so I can cut and mix the two of them together.
Okay.
So, how would you define classic rock?
Just give the same answer.
Yeah, like I would define classic rock as, and then just say whatever you're saying.
I would define classic rock as the foundation of modern rock music. I mean, the fact that I'm 25 years old and, you know, born in 1990, and these bands, Zeppelin, Rolling Stones, Ramones, they, at the height of their career, I didn't even exist yet. So I think that in itself speaks volumes, that someone like myself at 25 still listens to this music today. And I think that it carries over into modern rock music. A lot of bands draw their inspiration from that music because it's not just a great band with a great rock tune. There's so much tied to it. It's revolutionary. It's tied to so many historic moments, and I think people want to believe in something again, and that's why some people shy away from maybe the pop modern music, is because this type of music has so much longevity. It's created such an amazing outlet for people, musicians and anyone listening to that music. So with music, everything, it's a foundation, so everything needs to build. Everything is drawn from somewhere. So before classic rock, what preceded it was, you know, the basic rock and roll. You had Elvis Presley, you had Ike Turner, you had Jerry Lee Lewis. And before those classic rock bands even came in, they drew inspiration from before, and I think that's what music is. Music is constantly evolving and growing, and I think it creates just an amazing outlet for modern, new, emerging artists today.
How would you define classic rock? Like, what is classic rock? Very open-ended question.
Great. What is classic rock? Wow. It's a great question. I guess classic rock is defined as, you know, music from, you know, the 1960s to the, you know, late 1980s. And we have a show on Q107 called Psychedelic Sunday, which is 65 to 75, which is right that classic rock wheelhouse. I guess it would just be defined by those classic rock bands that paved the way for all the stuff, you know, that I grew up with in the early 90s, the Zeppelins, the Beatles, the Stones, you know, Pink Floyd. That's classic rock. Is classic rock a sound more than it is sort of like a stereotype? Maybe. I spoke with the Black Crowes. Were they classic rock? They had that sort of southern rock sort of sound. But to kind of bottle and define what classic rock is, I think is very hard. And people who are smarter and more literate than I could be able to tell you what classic rock is. For me, classic rock, you know, is more of a feeling. You know, music that moves you and you feel it inside. And, you know, music with soul, which is why I think that, you know, bands that we play now, like the Smashing Pumpkins, STP, Nirvana, the Black Keys, Kings of Leon, they all have music with soul in it, and you can feel it. And I think that's why that music stands out and why it can be so easily put into our playlist. But to define classic rock, I guess if you had to do it, it would just kind of be a snapshot of time.
How would you define classic rock?
Classic rock is, well, the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear classic rock, you think of the biggest bands. You think of Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, The Who, that sort of genre. Something that starts around the late 60s, goes right through to the late 80s. Now, when you start looking at other bands past that, funny enough, when we play a song from Pearl Jam, some of our listeners might say, well, why are you playing some of that newer stuff? And, you know, maybe time has gone quicker, that they don't realize that Pearl Jam's 25 years old. But for some reason, maybe it's a sound. Because, you know, first thing that people think of is Zeppelin, or Van Halen, or the Stones, like I mentioned, or Deep Purple. That's that big sound, that analog recording sound. That's basically what classic rock is.
You said it is a sound. Do you feel that there could be bands out there currently that have that classic rock sound that don't qualify as classic rock just because they're not old? Like, do you need to have a certain amount of longevity as a band in order to qualify as classic rock?
Well, to qualify as classic rock, classic is a part of it, right? So obviously it has to be a little bit older. And yeah, you're right. You know, there's a lot of bands who are mimicking that sound now. They're bringing back that sound. Monster Truck, you know, many bands like that are just bringing that kind of sound back. Sheepdogs as well. And you can't call them classic because they have a classic rock sound, but they're not from the 60s and 70s. I'd love to call them classic rock, but they're new.
You know, a lot of people have mixed feelings. They say that some people say classic rock might become the new oldies format. Classic rock is, you know, it's rejuvenating. What do you think? Do you think that it's going to die off, or do you think that it is going to have a comeback? Could there ever be another great band?
There's always room for another great band, and for it to fit in classic rock, it's going to have to wait a while, unfortunately. But one of the things about classic rock is, like that old phrase, it never dies. In fact, I think it's making the biggest resurgence it ever has. Vinyl's coming back in a big way. Some bands are actually reforming and touring again. And if you've ever taken a look at a lineup waiting to get into a Rolling Stones concert, keep in mind these guys have been performing for about 50 years. 50 years. And when you look at the lineup, you're seeing people who are above 50, but you're seeing 20-year-olds in there. And they're holding their tickets, and I've actually seen this. They're holding their tickets going, yeah, we're going to go see the Stones, as if it was the 60s. Or, you know, it's the longevity of it. Classic rock is here to stay. and it's always going to be something that's appreciated. Studies have even shown that some of the most popular rock and roll being listened to right now is from the 70s. It's kind of weird, but it's a fact. And when vinyl is coming back, we even have a show here on Dave Rocks that plays a full album feature Sunday nights at 9. And people are loving it because it's different. There was a 20-year period where everything went digital, and everyone liked the convenience. Download a song, but it took the intimacy out of rock and roll and full albums, because you couldn't go to the record store, buy the album, unwrap it, put the needle on the record, listen through side 1, listen through side 2, admire the album art. A lot goes into that album art, and that was missing for a good 20 years. And for some reason, and I never saw this coming, but albums are coming back, vinyl's coming back, and even the younger generation is going, wow, this is really cool. So in the history of rock and roll, there's like that 15, 20-year absence of vinyl, which, the full analog experience of classic rock is coming back. The best rock and roll ever created in the entire world. We're going to give it all to you right here.
Rock is a very important word in classic rock. Classic in and of itself is just a word to say, okay, if you look in the dictionary, it probably says something that people hold dearly or hold up or something, I don't know. But when you put classic with rock, it means, to me anyway, bands, artists that of their time, they were the best of breed. You could include Nirvana and Pearl Jam because they've kind of paid their dues. They're hitting the point where I think as radio looks at it, every 20 years there's a new set of acts that belong in their format. So yeah, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, all those bands that made great music, had great songs, played great, they deserve to be there. I would say, classic bands, that were successful, not necessarily superstar successful, but star successful. And with great songs and great musicians, really, that's where I class it as classic rock. So, like we talked about before, if you go back to the late 60s, you had Zeppelin and Purple and Hendrix and all these great artists and playing great music and great performances and great shows and great fans on top of it. And then everybody else followed on from those guys. They were the pioneers.
To me, it's like, what the hell is classic rock? I mean, you have bands like Zeppelin, Van Halen, Motley Crue on one end, and then you have Nirvana, U2, Pearl Jam on the other end. I mean, these are all the bands between the 60s and the 90s, which is the era which we're kind of told of the classic rock era. So I definitely think it's just an era. It's a time frame, and in my mind, it's guitar-driven, good guitar-driven melodies with no fancy frills, no million synthesizers. It's just raw, pure rock and roll. You get on stage, you play the record, and you see the band get on stage. It's the same sound.
Do you think it has to be blues-based guitar, or could it be any kind of guitar?
I think it could be any kind of guitar, but I definitely think that the blues bass is what inspired and drove a lot of these bands.
Well, classic rock, I mean, any label for any style of music, whether it's classic rock or country or this, you could play 10 different country artists and they don't sound the same, or in classic rock, labels with music are, it's if you could tell what it was by a label, then you wouldn't even have to listen to it, right? So classic rock, but yeah, and yet at the same time it takes on its meaning and with how people use it and how they look at it. And classic rock has become, I reckon, that maybe a lot of it has to do with the era that the music came from. A lot of it does have to do with that, but I don't know if it's really a style. If could there be a new group that you would call a classic rock group? So in a way, it's a different type of terminology than a lot of the other ones, like country or something, is that country is more timeless. Classic rock seems to be tied to a certain era.
How do you personally define the term classic rock?
To me, classic rock is everything that I kind of grew up with,
And I guess it would stop for me by the time maybe I joined KISS or something like that, because in some ways it feels like it was just rock and roll was passed on to new generations, and you can define each decade a bit. There's of course the British invasion. In the 70s, things really evolved quite a bit, and I still think that's very much classic rock too. But by the 80s, you get into like maybe the hair metal bands, okay, which would I say that Def Leppard and KISS are classic rock? I could, okay, but not the same when I've experienced seeing Hendrix at the Garden as a teenager. If you're a fan of classic cars, there's probably a cutoff point, okay? And you've heard that term probably. And I do think that music seems to always write its own rules, though, and seems to always follow paths that no one can ever predict. Okay, so that band that changed the 90s, let's say like Nirvana, maybe to some people, that's classic rock already, because it's been so many years.
Mm-hmm.
Seems odd to me.
Yeah.
Okay, but maybe not odd to someone else. Nor is it necessarily odd to the station that's known for classic rock, the radio station that's maybe even very famous for classic rock, playing Soundgarden or playing something even new, which is unusual. One of the local Los Angeles stations actually recently gave the show in the afternoon over to one of the punk guys, Jonesy's jukebox, and I hear him play some amazing things, some stuff I forgot, some stuff I love, obviously some more things that I don't know. But just to think, the concept, I was like I was actually really happy, because they broke the rule of some formula of radio programming, okay, mm-hmm. and went with a show where the guy's going to play what he wants, interview who he wants, bring in people. I think that was good, which is, again, just ways that I think the music business plays by its own rules, always. Where I really doubt if you had an amazing 1990s Corvette that would be considered a classic, okay, to the car people. I don't know a lot about the car business, but you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And here we are trying to define music in a category with the question of what is classic rock. So I think it's going to be different for a lot of people, but for me, probably the cutoff is going to be by the time maybe disco happened, I'm done with it. You know what I mean? Anything pre that, it's pretty much classic rock. Mm-hmm. And then the bands that I've worked with, that I really made a very large contribution to for my resume, some of them are truly classic rock, okay, which would be, obviously working with Meatloaf. Certainly KISS that's, I don't know how do you want to categorize. I think KISS breaks all the rules anyways, mm-hmm. as a musical band with such an incredible, unique history, But Grand Funk, obviously, which has been my gig now for all these years, much longer even than KISS, and the 17th year of me performing with them now, since the end of 99, 2000. They're clearly classic rock. So when I meet somebody on the plane, and I fly a lot, and they say, oh, you look like a musician, who you play with, I say, Grand Funk Railroad. Most of the time they've heard of it, or they know a song by the
Mm-hmm.
band. But lots of times, if I just want to generalize it, because I don't have the time, I'll just say, I play with a classic rock band, Sometimes I refer to it as like a heritage rock band, or whatever. And they kind of know then that that's somebody that was famous, in the past, but that music is still very valid in so many places. I would like to define classic rock more by an era. I know in my mind it's easier to say that Nirvana is not classic rock, okay? Even though I'm not changing the channel when it comes on, I like them, you know what I mean? But when I hear The Who, and when I hear the Rolling Stones, I'm talking about more of the more earlier stuff, of course, it throws me back to what I think is the kind of the beginnings of classic rock music, we know that there was Elvis before that, and Chuck Berry, and artists like that really building what was to become, this incredibly gigantic revolution in music, and obviously the Beatles in '64 coming to America changed the world. They were already popular, of course, in England and in parts of Europe, but that was it. You know, they just took over. And it started the wave of British, you know, bands.
Classic rock was, to me, it was a convenient term to package the music to a new audience, right? They didn't start describing it as classic rock until the 80s, as far as I can recall.
You're right. No, you're right.
Billboard was trying to say, okay, that's what this is, you know.
Classic rock station.
Yeah, and I think it was geared towards an audience that was getting older and that they were still buying products and listening to the radio. Remember the radio? The radio was great.
Some of it.
Yeah, some of it. No, actually, most. NEW in New York, 60s, 70s. I probably learned more about music through the DJs on those stations who weren't that beholden to the advertisers than I, probably have, searching out all this music myself. Yeah, I think most of the designation of classic rock, to me, still kind of locks it up because that's the only reason we call it that now. But I think it's kind of cool that it has a designated term, and it almost has a respect by calling it classic rock.
Yeah, they just threw rock at the end of it.
Nice. As opposed to shitty rock.
Classic rock is still there and alive. There's like some of the survivors are still out there playing, and really enjoying the magical life that we've had as little kids with a dream, wanting to be like Elvis or Gene Vincent or Eddie Cochran, or wanting to be like the Beatles or the Stones, or wanting to be like the Beach Boys, or wanting to be like Hendrix or Clapton or Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page. You've got to want that you want to be like, and you and your buddies all copy Zeppelin, or you all copy, whoever your band is, and you emulate them and copy them, and suddenly you have your own hit, and you kind of keep going. And that's a dream, and to have it still going after decades and decades, it really is, it should be called Classic Dreams instead of Classic Rock, because it's amazing that we all had the same dream. We were all, if you look at it, we're all inspired by what I just mentioned, the Elvis era, the Beatles era, and then the later 60s, the power trios from England. And if you're more soul, it was the Motown and Stax and that kind of thing,
What distinguishes oldies from classic? That's a real good question. And I think oldies, to me, would be like 50s, and it became kind of some early 60s stuff. So it depends on who you are, but, I don't even like the word oldies, because what is Elvis oldies? Elvis was cool. Beatles were great. So oldies. I don't even like the term. I think classic rock is a better term, but again, created by radio stations to promote themselves. So that's really what it is to me. I think classic rock is great music, and I don't care if it's from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, wherever it's from. Even 2000s has great classic music. It just doesn't get dubbed classic rock. But it'll become classic when it's been around a long time.
The roots of classic rock was certainly came from, I really do feel like the blues were a very important part of that, because again, my definition being bands like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, all right. There's no doubt that there was something, especially that Led Zeppelin really plugged into, maybe a little bit too much, if you know what I mean, because there was some definitely riffs that they borrowed, and the way they, presented those riffs, and the music that they wrote around that, and the same raw passion was in that, because those blues artists, definitely, it was all emotion, but it wasn't sophisticated with the kind of sound that Jimmy Page was able to bring to that band, There's no doubt that the blues was a really integral part of classic rock, even though everybody might have dressed it up a little bit differently. But I think the best example to prove that is like a Led Zeppelin, and the whole scales that are used, and the whole approach to the guitar playing is very much, they call it the pentatonic scale, and that's a blues scale, Now, how creative you are with it, what Jeff Beck could do with it will make you cry, okay, because he's just such a monster. But the fact that the majority of the leads from all the bands and all the hits that are pretty basically in that mode. And it doesn't make it redundant. It's what you do with it, and how you make it like really. I look at guitar playing as like a singing voice, but singers like Plant and Roger Daltrey, and I don't have to tell you what I think of Lennon and McCartney singing, and all those bands, the AC/DC guys, they're screaming, but it's all raw passion, and it is to me it does feel like blues, all of it, you know, just wrapped up in a whole different kind of package.
There's this new song called Stairway to Heaven. You may have heard of it once or twice.
Yeah, it might be an okay song. It might stand the test of time. I don't know. Again, they're great songs. I'm not dissing the songs at all. It's just that these bands have so many incredible songs in their catalog. And I just, there's those, every one of them has those 2 or 3 that were carved out and branded the classic songs. And I get it. But for me, it doesn't get me excited. To me, classic rock just means the cream of the crop, the most enduring stuff. But what's frustrating for me about it is that it's not, for my personal taste, a wide enough net. I just wish it would be a little bit more adventurous. I just wish that people who programmed it or loved it would look deeper into these artists' catalog. I think that so many of these artists that are deemed classic rock, you say to the person on the street, you rattle off Thin Lizzy, and they're going to say the boys are back in town. But unfortunately, they're not going to know about the other amazing songs and albums that band has. Mm-hmm. Why? Because classic rock doesn't play them. A lot of it is that people just live with what they've been force-fed, and they don't take the initiative to look a little deeper and say, okay, maybe there's other songs, maybe there's other tracks if we like that period from a band. And that leads into a whole nother conversation, but something else that's happening with classic rock bands that is the newest, most emerging thing, and that is them becoming brands instead of bands. And what I mean by that is you're seeing a few instances where you have bands on the road with one, sometimes no original members who actually created that music. But what do they have? They're playing the songs, and they have the rights to the name and the logo. And some people, in some instances, don't care. I'm hearing these great songs. I don't even care who's actually playing them for me. A band like Foreigner has set a huge precedent that a lot of people are taking notice of right now, where they have been touring for a while now with 0 original members. But Foreigner is so synonymous with classic rock and had so many incredible songs, but they were also somewhat of a faceless band. It wasn't really about who was in the band, it was just about the songs, and the songs continue to live on and people still love them to this day. So they don't look all that close. Oh wow, Foreigner's playing? Those songs are great, I'm going to go see them. And they get there, it's like, oh wow, Lou Graham's not singing them? Well, this guy sounds great. We're cool with this. So as classic rock evolves and younger people come out and want to see these bands live, the artists who actually made it can't do it anymore. Either their skills have eroded, they can't sing anymore. Unfortunately, some of them aren't with us anymore. But that's not going to stop the classic rock machine from still moving, because now they're actually bringing in all these replacement members. And if they can sell it to the people, they're going to sell it. And they're going to have that entity known as Foreigner playing and continuing to tour and bringing in a whole new fan base to follow them. Foreigner this summer opened for Kid Rock. So there's a newer, younger audience compared to Foreigner hearing this band called Foreigner that most of the time had no original members, just playing great songs. So it's just another way to reinvent and keep this classic rock machine rolling. And a lot of people have taken huge notice to what Foreigner has done and the success they've had with it, and trying to figure out if they can do it. You mentioned Kiss before. They've halfway done it. They're going to replace all of those guys with people impersonating the original band. And that's going to happen sooner than later. And they're going to market a sanctioned tribute. Some people are going to buy it. I was just on the phone yesterday with Ricky Medlock, who plays in Lynyrd Skynyrd. He used to have a band called Blackfoot that was big in the classic rock world. He's putting out a new version of Blackfoot. He's not even going to be in it. He's going to go and put all these young guys out playing his songs and kind of sanction it. Just another way to reinvent and turn over this catalog and appeal to the classic rock fans.
Do you think that heavy metal belongs in the story of classic rock?
Sure, but I think what happens is when a heavy metal artist or song gets embraced by classic rock, it kind of mainstreams it out to some degree. It's not so metal anymore.
Yeah.
You talk about AC/DC. It's kind of like hard to think that something like You Shook Me All Night Long at one point was considered some sort of metal thing. I'll give you an example. When I got into radio, I started radio in '83, and when I got into radio, I wanted to do something called a metal show on the radio. Nobody was really doing anything like that at the time. There's only maybe one or two other ones. And I was working at a record store. And it was across the street from the radio station. And the owners of the store would come in all the time. And I was selling records. This was '83. I was selling records from 3 bands that they weren't playing, that they weren't touching on the radio.
Which bands were these?
Def Leppard, who had just put out Pyromania, Quiet Riot, who had just put out Mental Health, and the first Metallica record.
Kill 'Em All?
Kill 'Em All. And all these records were selling and doing well, but radio wouldn't touch them. And when the owners would come in, I'd say, hey, how come you guys aren't playing this stuff? And they would be like, oh, that's, we don't do heavy metal on the station. We can't. It's too alienating, whatever. So I said, but we're selling tons of it. I'm here selling. People are buying it. They must want to hear it. No. So that's the way I got my show on the air, was by pushing them to give me an outlet to play this stuff. They said, okay, we'll give you 3 hours a week. Come up and play it. Now that's '83. If you flash forward and you think to yourself, 2 of those records for sure, Mental Health and Pyromania, went on to sell millions and millions of records shortly after that. Now, there's songs from both of those records that are considered to be classic rock songs.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, they were songs that they were so abrasive that they didn't know what to do with them. But as my point is that as time goes on, this stuff is viewed under a different lens. It's looked at differently, and it's looked at like, well, it's stood the test of time. It's not so abrasive anymore. There's people that like it. It's grown. It's like it's taken on a whole new life. It's looked at in a whole different way. But I think what happens is every once in a while you have these metal acts that cross over and become so big that then they have to become accepted by classic rock. Great example of that would be Metallica with something like Enter Sandman. Eventually, if not already, that is considered classic rock, and that does get played on classic rock radio. That's the only Metallica song that's going to get played on classic rock, but it's become so big that where once it was considered a metal thing, now it's considered a classic rock thing. It happens all the time, and it really just speaks to the way these songs hold up and how the lens they're looked at in 20 years on after they've come out. And if it's looked at as something that's still stood the test of time and that was impactful enough at the time, okay, we can start to kind of spoon feed that to the classic rock audience. And I think that's really all that it's about. I think when you look at the umbrella of classic rock, you're going to find everything from, Love is a Battlefield by Pat Benatar, which is basically a pop song, to You Shook Me All Night Long, to Welcome to the Jungle, to Crazy Train. Crazy Train is certainly metal. It was considered metal when it came out. It's a metal song. But it's now accepted by classic rock, and to me it just becomes a rock song. So it's not about, I think when you get into the realm of classic rock and you become, a song reaches that sort of level, the categories that originally existed in are thrown out. Doesn't matter anymore. It's just, now it's classic rock. The band could still be considered metal or what have you, and it might be the only song that makes it into that sort of umbrella, but when you get to the point of it being classic rock, it's just classic rock at that point. You've arrived, there's been enough put into it that it's like enough research done, enough acceptance to the song that it's like, okay, this is just classic rock now.
Where does that border begin between metal and, hard rock?
Well, it's a good question because I think that there is a difference between the two. Some people don't make a distinction. Some people just kind of put it all under one umbrella. That happened a lot in the 80s where people were like, everything from Def Leppard and Poison to Metallica and Megadeth were all just considered and called heavy metal. Even to this day, you'll see shows, TV shows that are, Metal Mania Hour or whatever on VH1 Classic or whatever, and you'll see Bon Jovi in there, and you'll see Megadeth in there, and you'll see Anthrax in there, and you'll see Poison in there. It still goes into that big sort of melting pot, and I think that's one of the things that's caused it some problems, because there is a distinct difference. To me, hard rock has more melody to it. It is more accessible, and it's just really rock music with just maybe a little bit more edge in the guitars. Metal, a lot of what makes metal to me is the presentation, and there's a lot more aggression in it. And visually, it's completely different. So it's very hard for me to put into words, but you can rattle off a band to me, and I'll tell you right now, in my view, are they hard rock or are they metal? And to me, it's very clear cut. I don't know why, maybe just from doing this my whole life, I just kind of make it, in my mind, there's an immediate distinction. In my opinion, AC/DC was always a hard rock band. And the reason why I say that is because so much of what they do originates from a blues-based structure. To me, they're just a hard rock band. I'll tell you, Motorhead, when you come to a band like Motorhead, Lemmy will fight you on being called heavy metal. And he's a guy that people consider to be like one of the founding fathers, like an icon of heavy metal. And he does not consider himself or Motorhead to be heavy metal. He considers it to be a loud rock and roll band. Every time they come on stage, we are Motorhead, we play rock and roll.
What is the importance of the dual guitar to the identity of heavy metal?
I think that visually and sonically, it gives the impression of more guitars, louder guitars, Visually, you're seeing two guys with double the amount of guitars. And sonically, there's two guitars going on to hear. Whether they're dual lead guitars or whether they're rhythm, and it just makes for a beefier, bigger sound. And most metal bands embrace that. There's another thing here that is just, I have to remember, because I'm so close to this, and I've worked in this business my whole life, and because I'm around music constantly. There's another thing about this whole classic rock thing. At the end of the day, it's really good stuff, and I think that you can analyze it and rip it down and do all this sort of research about it, but at the end of the day, the real quality about it is it's really great. It still sounds great to a lot of people. It still moves people. And whether they're new people just discovering it who are younger, or the people who grew up with it as it goes, there's a reason why it still endures, because it's great. I may be sick of it. I may personally, a lot of it, not need to ever hear again, but I live it. I have to take myself out. I have to put myself in the perspective of the guy who doesn't live it, of the guy who has a 9-to-5 Monday to Friday job, and when he gets in his car at 5 o'clock to go home, he wants to hit the preset, and he damn well wants to hear Walk This Way, because he knows it. It's like a warm blanket. It's like, okay, I'm good now, I don't, because I look at it from a different perspective. I was the guy who's delivered that to people. It's like, oh, I can't hear it ever again. But to the people, it feels good, it is good, and it's what they want. And if you can bring in younger people into that world, great, through playing some of the current bands. Because the older people that grew up with it are they're gonna die with it. They're staying with it the whole way. It is turning over that demographic. And it's no coincidence that a lot of these bands are still the biggest money grabbers on the road, because people want to hear those songs, and then they play those songs, and now you're 50 and you're bringing your kids to the show, or you're 40 and you're bringing your kids to the show, and suddenly they're getting into the songs.
Are there certain elements that need to be present in a rock band to even be considered classic rock?
Well, they have to be rock, and they have to endure. They have to stand the test of time. They have to have made such important albums or songs that connect with the artist, connect to the audience in a way that it takes them back into that place and time. And it's got to be immediately identifiable, you know, and it's got to have a certain sound and feel that captures that and pulls the audience in. A lot of what classic rock is about is a trip down memory lane, is making people feel good, giving people memories of what it was like when they first heard that song. So yeah, and within the boundaries of classic rock, it's a pretty wide net as far as some of the sounds and styles that you'll hear. You'll get everything from AC/DC to Manfred Mann to Moody Blues. You know, there's a wide net, but it all kind of falls into that same sort of thing. It's like, wow, you know, I remember when that came out. That was really cool. I think a lot of what classic rock is taking the listener back to a place and time when that music came out, and making them feel good and making them feel like they felt when they first heard or got that music. And that is really one of the big keys of what classic rock is all about. It's a trip down memory lane. If you're 50, it puts you in the headspace of when you were 20. And everybody wants to be younger and everybody wants to be a kid again. So I think that plays a huge, huge role. As every 10, 15 years go by, it has to evolve, it has to move forward, because otherwise, classic rock becomes what's known as oldies. You know, there's a whole nother format here, oldies. My parents grew up in the 50s. They like what they call the oldies. And that's a format in America as well, the oldies format, playing Elvis Presley and playing 50s music. And you need to move it forward. And this is getting into a whole nother conversation, but one of the things that makes classic rock from a radio standpoint so appealing to radio stations is that it appeals to a very desirable demographic, and that is men between the ages of, say, 30 and 50 years old. That is a key demo for advertisers, because that's what people that have money and are at a point in their life where they have families and money and they want to spend that money and they have things they need to spend it on. So you need to stay in that demographic, because you don't want to get too much younger than that. You don't want to get too much older than that, because people's priorities change and how they want to spend money and what appeals to them changes. So it's very important, and that's one of the reasons why classic rock has to move the needle forward and start eventually playing 80s, and then after a certain point start playing 90s and keep moving that forward, because if it doesn't, the fan base will just keep growing with it and it becomes too old. And when you become too old, you lose the sellability to the advertisers. So there's a whole business behind the classic rock model as well. And if you came at, you know, if you grew up with Soundgarden and Nirvana, well, if you grew up with those artists, you're probably around 40 years old right now. So as a result, you're starting to see Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, certain tracks pop up in classic rock radio. The biggest problem that's happening now is the number one thing that I see happening as a byproduct of the internet and a byproduct of, and as a result of the internet, the record companies basically going away for the most part, let alone record stores. I mean, I've got this whole other feeling about everything. I grew up working in a record store, and I still am a huge fan of physically owning music. I'm still a huge fan of CDs. I still want my music that way. But I think that what's happened because of the internet and everything is that we've lost, with most people, any desire to have physical ownership of music. It's a stream, it's a file, it's something that they just pass around, and it's completely devalued music, in my opinion. Again, you can trace that back to the internet. The other big problem that I see is complete oversaturation. Because of the demise of record companies, you don't have any gatekeepers anymore for what's good and bad. Basically, if you had a band or you made a record, mm-hmm. if you got a record deal and you physically could hand somebody a record, and I could say, here, Daniel, here's my new record, here's a CD, and you got it, and you're like, wow. The whole idea of owning and holding and looking at something and photos and the booklet. Well, I just think that it comes down to a case of oversaturation. I just think that there's too much out there for people to process. There's no gatekeeper. There's no filter. There's nothing stopping people from creation to delivery. And again, some may look at that as a very positive thing. And for creativity, it is. But for fans to disseminate what's real and what's not, it makes things very, very difficult. The record company structure has collapsed, so A&R people and all that sort of stuff are gone, and you have all these outlets. Anyone can make a video with their iPhone. Anybody can make music with their computer. Anybody can deliver that music through the internet. So again, there's no barriers, and for every positive that brings, there's also a bunch of negatives. It makes it way harder to stand out from the crowd. It makes it way harder to get attention. And there's nobody saying to these people, hey, your songs aren't good. Hey, your band's not good. You're not ready to be putting stuff out. Who cares? The market's just flooded and flooded. And for the consumer, the fan, it dilutes stuff. And it makes it very difficult. There are record companies that are, put out 30 records a month. They don't do anything for them. The bands never will last past a week, but they're just pumping stuff into the system, and it just dilutes it and crowds it. And for fans, they don't know what's real and what's not anymore. We're also in a time where everyone, because of social media, it's so PC. Everyone is so hypersensitive to criticism. Everybody wants, you say the slightest little thing. It always amazes me. People will say to me all the time, hey, we really want to know what you think of this band. And they'll pound me on it, whether it's on Twitter or whatever. And what do you really think of whatever band? Okay, you want to know, here's what I think. And I'll tell them. Just my opinion. And if they don't agree with that opinion, then suddenly it's like they go crazy. Like, Eddie was shit talking this band, and then it's like whoa, and then it becomes this domino and this snowball that rolls. And by the end of the day, it became, Eddie said you should be decapitated. It's like, no, I didn't. No, I just said I didn't care for the band. But that's this sort of social media machine that has perpetuated in this. Everyone's looking for that angle, that person to slip up. It's just also another huge diversion from music. Whereas when I was a kid growing up, when a record was released, that was a huge day. You cared about, you stood in line at the record store. It was you checked your calendar for that day. You wanted that record the day it came out. You wanted to hold it. You wanted to open it. You wanted to smell it. You wanted to look at it. You wanted to see if, as a big Kiss fan, first thing I'd do when I would get a record back in those days is I'd open the cellophane on the side and I'd shake it like this, because there would always be stuff stuffed in the album jacket, flyers to buy more Kiss junk, or, a tattoo or a poster or something. Like, wow, what's going to come out? You were so connected. That was your world. You stood in line to get the concert ticket. You stood in line when the record came out. You had that record. You looked at it all week. You played it. You became connected with it. That's all gone now. That going away is so important to the devaluation of music now. And then you factor in the fact that because of technology, everything is on demand, everything is immediate, attention spans are so much shorter, you want it quick, you want it how you want it, and as a result, it's just created this thing where like a record comes out and a new band comes out, and in a week they could be forgotten about already because there's no artist development either. I still, to this day, on both of my radio shows, play new music from new bands, but also new music from classic rock bands. The problem is, a lot of these bands make new records. A lot of these classic rock bands make new records. Some of them are really good. The challenge for them is to get people to know or care that they've made new music, because by and large, nobody cares about it. They all want to just hear the hits, the old stuff that they know and love. That to me has always kind of sucked, because I like the bands that I grew up with. I like to see where they go and grow and how they evolve and how they change. But classic rock, if anything, if there's a negative connotation to it for me, is the fact that it's just so stuck in one era. It's so stuck in one thing. It doesn't continue the lineage of what these bands do. And a lot of them have made some really good records that have been completely ignored because by and large, classic rock does not play new music at all. And I think that's a problem. So I always play new music from new artists that I like and new music from classic rock artists that's still good, because I think it's important to move the whole thing forward as far as just living in one decade or stuck in one decade. I think it's important to continue to progress. And people say to me all the time, why do you think that? And I said, well, I think about in '83 when this new band came to me called Metallica that nobody ever heard of. Yeah. And I played them. And I'm glad that I did. I'm glad that I can say I truly did. In 1989, this band came to me called Skid Row. That was from here in New Jersey. Hey man, will you play our record? We just got this new singer named Sebastian Bach. Will you check out our record? I have the tape of playing it. So yeah, okay, sure. That's a new band at the time. That wasn't classic rock. And then what happened with them? So it's always cool when you can see that arc and see where bands that are considered now. I've been fortunate, I've been in this business long enough that bands that are considered classic rock now, I was actually there at their birth. I saw that happen. I saw Guns N' Roses play the Ritz in '87 when Appetite came out. Before that was classic rock. So it's cool when you can look back and have that perspective and realize how important it is, at least I think, to still, as long as, of course, you love and you embrace all the old stuff, but to also keep an eye on what's happening going forward.
We're in such a different time because everybody's attention's in so many different places. Unfortunately, the biggest thing I regret as a music fan is that music doesn't have the same amount of importance placed on it as it did to fans that grew up with 70s, 80s, or even 90s music. Music is delivered differently now. It's not viewed as this sort of super important thing. You used to line up and wait for your favorite record to come out and go to the record store and buy it. You'd listen to the radio hoping that they were going to play that song. You'd wait on MTV and hope to see that video come up. All that's gone now. It's just like, it's on demand. It's like, okay, somebody put out a record. Oh, I'll click on YouTube. I'll listen to the stream. I don't know. Maybe I'll buy the download. Maybe I won't. I mean, it's just disposable now. It's just, it blows my mind that people put out new records and I see all this build up to it for like a month, and the record is literally dead and forgotten within a week of its release. It's like it never even came out because it's instant satisfaction. It's let's just get our fans who care, get everybody to buy it in the first week, and then they give up trying to sell it beyond that because people don't have the attention span for it anymore. Really bums me out. It's something that it's hard for me to come to grips with as somebody who grew up and still loves buying music, owning music, grew up working in a record store. The biggest thing I can say in a nutshell is the relationship with music and most of the younger fans is completely different than it would have been with somebody as recently as just 10 years ago. With the introduction of music videos, the biggest change is that it all became very quickly about image. It was very much about what you looked like. It was very much about if you had a good-looking lead singer. It was very much about your hair, your outfits, your styling. That became a huge, huge issue. And I know for a fact, I worked for a record company and at that time, and we would go out and look for bands, and I would talk to people at other labels, and I'd be like, yeah, I went to see this band or I went to see that band. And instead of the questions being about, well, how did they sound or what was their writing like, or was it like, well, what did they look like? That was immediately something that became a huge thing because what people realized was pretty quickly was like, hey, if they don't have songs, well, we can get them some songs. If they can't play that well, we can use some session guys in the studio to make the record. So that became a big thing. It's like, well, but if we got, guys that are great performers and look great, we can fix everything else around it. So the visual of what MTV did and how impactfully that sold records, which I witnessed firsthand, is something that completely turned the industry on its head. Back in those days, you got your video on MTV, you got it in the countdown shows. There were these countdown shows, Dial MTV and all these nightly countdown shows. If you got your video in that top 10 countdown every day and you had a record in the store, then radio followed TV. That was the first time that really happened. Radio followed TV. Then all of a sudden you're getting video airplay. Then you go to the record companies would go to the radio stations and say, hey, we got this many airings on MTV. And then radio would start to consider playing you. It used to work the opposite. MTV and video was so powerful that you get on MTV, radio had to come to the party. Happened many times. There were a lot of bands that benefited from a lot of video airplay where the videos were actually bigger than anything in their history. Quiet Riot were the first band to be a metal band to have a #1 record. And I think a lot of that was driven by MTV with Come On Feel the Noise and Metal Health. But it even went back further than that. I mean, early MTV artists that had huge success with videos, people like Billy Squier, even like for the first time in America, Triumph was seen on MTV. They were a 70s band, but all of a sudden people were starting to see Triumph, and 10 years into their career, they had this whole renaissance in America because they were the early adapters to MTV, and they had some old concert clips and they put them on. So even before Quiet Riot, I think to a large degree, Def Leppard, probably in my opinion, the most synonymous band with music videos and MTV success. You can't get Bon Jovi, can't get bigger, and for that matter, Twisted Sister. Those are bands to me, all of them that come to mind is just in lockstep with the success of MTV playing their videos, and that being the driver for radio play and concert ticket sales and everything else. I'm waiting for rock radio to embrace what I think is a really, really underserved audience out there, and that is people who grew up with 80s rock music. By and large, they're getting ignored. You're going to be shoveled either 70s or shoveled 90s. There's this huge section sitting there that isn't being served, and that's why you see the success of these sort of festivals and cruises and events, because it's a community sort of thing. It's just like, okay, this is our stuff. This is what we got into. But it's all relative to how old you are.
So do you think that if like a young band comes out that captures that 80s feel, would that blow up? Do you would that be possible?
No, I don't believe, well, hard to say. I honestly don't know how any band blows up today. I really don't. Yeah, I mean, I think that the visual end of it was a huge, huge part of what, there's a lot of terms for that era of music. A lot of people use the term hair metal, which I personally don't like, and I don't use, but I just prefer to call it 80s hard rock, and that's what I think it was. I think that every era has its fashion. If you look at the 50s, guys were wearing pompadours and jackets and whatever. If you look at the 60s, maybe it was kind of like a hippie thing with tie-dye. The 70s, it was bell-bottom jeans and whatever. 80s, it was big hair and spandex. 90s, it was flannel. Every era of music has a look. I never really understood why the 80s had to be defined by the look as opposed to the music. Just like anything, there were good and bad bands in every decade. But the look became so major because of MTV, because these guys were plastered all over MTV. A guy like Kip Winger, who was a poster child for, to a lot of people, what was wrong with the 80s and the looks department as far as the style over substance thing, couldn't be more opposite. Kip's to this day, is one of the most talented people out there. I mean, the guy knows how to play classical music, and I mean, even Winger back in the 80s was light years better musicians than any of their peers for the most part. But because of their look, they got pigeonholed as, for whatever reason, took the biggest hits. So it was very unfair, and it remains that way to a lot of bands, unfortunately. But a lot of it was driven by MTV. That's why if you go one step beyond classic rock, and maybe this will be your next film, and look into what's called oldies, you'll be shocked to see that a lot of what classic rock radio plays is also played on these oldies formats. Now, they've rebranded a lot of it and don't call it oldies anymore because now there's a little bit of a stigma towards that. But you know, so it all comes down to a generational thing. To me, the only timeline for classic rock, to me, it's very personal. It really just depends upon how old you are, what you grew up in, what you grew up being exposed to, and it's very generational. What a radio station may view as classic rock is probably very different than what an individual looks at as classic rock. I believe it's completely down to demographics. And I think that classic rock has to turn over, has to evolve, and has to just move forward. I think that for a lot of people, maybe a little younger than me, their era of classic rock are the 80s bands. I can't tell you how many 80s themed festivals I host every year, or cruises, or things like that. And it's all geared, most of it, towards 80s oriented bands. And the reason for that is because if you're between 35 and 45 years old, that was your classic rock. Your classic rock wasn't Derek and the Dominoes. Your classic rock wasn't Eric Clapton or the Grateful Dead. It was Whitesnake. It was Def Leppard. It was Bon Jovi. That's what you grew up with. Now, you may have gone back and discovered earlier stuff through your parents or what have you, but that's the stuff that struck a nerve with you. Rat, another huge MTV band. You know, bands like that. And the disconnect, which is really strange when it comes to classic rock radio, is by and large, they've ignored a lot of those bands in mainstream radio play. There's a little Def Leppard, maybe an occasional Whitesnake song. Certainly Bon Jovi has crossed over into pop now. But for the most part, all these bands, you're never going to hear Winger. Maybe you'll hear Round and Round by Rat. But there's so many bands that had these huge careers, Cinderella, what have you, on MTV. They rarely get played to this day on classic rock radio. Classic rock radio, again, it goes back to that stigma I talked about. They almost jumped right over the 80s and went from the 70s right to the 90s. You'll hear more Pearl Jam and Soundgarden on classic rock today than you'll ever hear of the 80s MTV era. It was very stigmatized, wrongfully so, but very stigmatized. Every sporting event coming out of a timeout, the players walk out, they play Crazy Train for whatever reason. It's the introduction theme, just like Welcome to the Jungle. There's so many teams. So that mainstreams it out. It gets so ingrained in the consciousness of people. It's just like, oh, that's just, you know, it becomes classic rock as opposed to what it started out, which was metal. So it's just stuff that happens over time, shows up in movies, shows up in sporting events. You know what, I never really played that song before on my radio show. I'm going to start playing it. Maybe that happens 25 years ago. And then they play it. And then the next guy, the competing radio station in town says, wait a minute, he's playing Crazy Train now? He's doing well with playing that? I better play it. The music industry, like many industries, is incredibly copycat. So if they see success somewhere, everybody's going to try to imitate it and duplicate it. It only takes a couple people to take the risk, and then others will just jump on. And if they have success with it, they'll chase it. I love classic rock, but I also feel that it's so important for fans and for the industry and everybody to also look at what's next. Don't close off the world. Don't let your thinking of what music was end at 1986. There was great music. My favorite era for music personally is the 70s, followed very closely by the 80s. But that doesn't mean I still don't stop looking and exploring and playing and supporting and searching for new bands, because there's tons of them that have that flavor. And they need help and support too. So I just wish people would be a little bit more adventurous, because this music we're not in the 70s, we're not in the 80s, we're not in the 90s. It's not going to be right in your face. It's not going to be on your TV. It's probably not going to be on your local radio station, but it's out there. You can find it, and these bands need your support, because we can't do a movie like this 20 years from now if nobody plays new bands now. I've heard new young bands that are phenomenal, and nobody seems to care. And I try my darndest to play them on my radio show, talk about them, tell people, and told people 100 times, hey, you're going to Black Sabbath, great young new band, newish band opening for them called Rival Sons. get there early, go see them. They're opening every Sabbath date because there's a band that's a newer band that totally channels a 70s vibe. But here in America, they still can't get, they're not getting anywhere. Gonna go see AC/DC? Get there early. There's a band called Tyler Bryant and the Shakedown opening. Young guys from Nashville, killer band. Does the connection happen? Hasn't yet. So it's really frustrating, and I don't think it's any indictment on the quality of the bands. I think it's just the times that we're in. I just think that people are way more passive about it because they've got so many other things going on. I just met somebody recently who told me that the hologram technology is becoming very popular. You saw Tupac at Coachella a few years ago, a virtual hologram of Tupac. I know for a fact that's being looked at and considered for development for iconic rock artists. So these guys will live on forever. The fact that we've lost so many iconic artists like Glenn Frey, like David Bowie, like Prince. Listen, somebody said, and I don't know who or where, but some artists are even bigger in death than they are when they're alive. And I think that these guys passing away has even fueled their status as classic rock icons even more. So I think look what happens when these guys die. Their records, all of a sudden Prince had like 5 records on the charts at the same time. I never understood that, by the way. It's like, if you were a fan when they were alive, why didn't you have those records already? I never quite understood that whole phenomenon, but that's another story. But no, I mean, what you're seeing now is artists trying to find a way to live forever. Because what they're finding is that the brand is bigger than the band. And it's not always so much who's in the band. It's all about, hey, can we still sell this?
It's almost like classic rock has to be like a state of mind. Like, you have to want to listen to classic rock and have to want to enjoy it. Because like I said, when I was a kid, classic rock to me was my dad's music. It was Led Zeppelin, it was Jimi Hendrix, it was The Doors, and I didn't like it because it was my dad's music. Not because the music wasn't good, but because it was my dad's music. And then as I grew up and I'm listening to, Kashmir from Led Zeppelin and, songs from The Doors and songs from Jimi, I'm like, this is unbelievable and this is still good today, and no wonder my dad liked it, you know what I mean? So I feel like, if you're a kid and you're thinking classic rock is your dad's music, when you get older, the songs that you like are going to be classic rock. If you got a kid like me who grew up in the 90s and you're listening to Nirvana, you turn on a classic rock station now, you're going to hear Nirvana. It's not your dad's music anymore, it's your music. So I feel like classic rock, even though the songs are older, they're still continuing to bring out new songs in the classic rock format because the bands that we loved as a kid are now getting older and becoming classic rock. We play a mix of everything. If you look at our music for an hour, you'll probably hear, 3 to 4 classic rock songs, 3 to 4 songs from the 90s, and 3 to 4 current songs. So we have a bit of a mix of everything, and classic rock is in no means dying, but I think, if you have just classic rock, people might start to get bored and they want to see what's, coming in the future. It's funny, man, I used to work at a all classic rock station, and somebody asked me on the radio live, they said, what is classic rock? And I kind of froze a little bit because what is classic rock? Classic rock can be so many different things to so many different people. And my boss at the time, she had told me classic rock is a rock song that's been around for 20 years or more. And if you use that theory, that means that any song on any album could be on a classic rock station today, as long as it was made 20 years or more ago. And then I started thinking to myself, what is classic rock? And to me, classic rock is a song that was written years ago, let's use 20 years as the example, that is still just as good today as it was when it was released 20 or more years ago. Like, an easy example, Stairway to Heaven from Led Zeppelin, released in the 70s. You put that track on today, even though people have heard it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times, it still gives you the same feeling today as it did in the 70s when that song was released.
Define classic rock. Is it simply blues-based hard rock from the 60s to the late 70s, early 80s? Is it an aesthetic? What is it to you?
It's an amalgam of several styles of music, all culminating in, well, first of all, it's when electricity was introduced to music. That's the beginning to me of where classic rock begins. It's the biggest, it was the greatest musical statement of the last half of the 20th century. So, and now that's fairly inarguable. because it's had a gigantic impact for the last 50 years, we shall say, or roughly, on a huge chunk of the planet. That's what I think it is.
Phenomenal. There's a lot of musicians I've spoken to, a lot of record executives, etc., who they really emphasize the blues-based, jazz-based foundation of classic rock.
Yeah.
I personally think that the classical music influence, particularly on European classic rock, is highly overlooked. Do you think that classic rock has a classical symphonic type of bass? Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I would agree wholly that without a blues underpinning, to all of rock, that really is that's the departure point. Blues, very American-based influences, I think, started rock. Okay, but the introduction of outside influences, so whether they be jazz or boogie woogie, which is kind of blues-based, and particularly classical music, those are important elements that kind of found their way in. And I would say mostly I would say in the mid 60s, classical music began to make its first little foray into really having a strong influence on it. And I think the first time that I really fully noticed that would be probably the Revolver album of the Beatles. The first time I heard string quartet in Eleanor Rigby, that is Eleanor Rigby's an entirely classically kind of underpinned piece of music to my way of hearing it anyway. There are no blues chords in there. There's just this kind of what at that time sounded like extremely modern pop song, but with a very classical underpinning to it because of the addition of the string quartet. That, and I guess you'd say the song Yesterday, even the Rolling Stones with As Tears Go By. There were songs like that had some folk classical influence in there that suddenly found its way into the center of what would ultimately become classic rock. And from there, it grew with, I started noticing piano players like Nicky Hopkins on the Rolling Stones album where he played Satanic Majesty's Request, where he played that very classical opening to She's a Rainbow. That's where I started to hear, that's very Bach-like, and started to really notice that classical music was having a deeper and deeper impact on what rock musicians were writing. And by the time I decided to put my guitar down and switch to piano, we were in the beginning of the 70s when Elton John and Rick Wakeman and Keith Emerson and Freddie Mercury, there's 4 keyboard players there that all of whom were classically trained and to some degree.
I think what's first of all interesting to describe classic rock and how it can expand is that the Beatles are not considered classic rock, but the Rolling Stones are. So you don't really hear the Beatles that much on classic rock stations. You hear the Who, Zepp, Floyd. It's like the Beatles are in a category unto themselves, pop rock, whatever they are, they're something else, but they're not exactly classic rock, where the Rolling Stones, the Who, Zepp, and Floyd represent the eldest of this classic rock era. Then you're moving through the Kansas's Foreigners, REO Speedwagon, Styx versions of classic rock, which are basically American arena rock acts, and then you've got the Priests, like I said, the AC/DCs, the Us, and the Def Leppards, and the Sabbaths, and then you look at these bands that still are guitar-based, driven, heavy, loud rock bands, and that's the Nirvanas and the Pearl Jams and the Alice in Chains, and they are being considered classic rock. Why? Because they're 25 years old or older, or 30 years old. So therefore, the demographic of radio listeners starts to move up, and when those kids were 18, now they're 38, 48 years old. So they would encompass, I would think, demographically, the classic rock audience. There will age out at a certain point, because after those bands, the question is, what is after those bands? Is it Fall Out Boy? I mean, is that going to be 20 years from now? I don't know. But I think that the classic rock moniker would cover Pearl Jams and Alice in Chains and Nirvana ultimately as the aging out of the audience continues.
What are your thoughts about the internet?
Well, my thoughts are mixed, of course. They're they're a reality of it. I mean, they're probably very similar to when records themselves came out. I think I'll bet you could probably take a lot of people's opinions about the internet and the impact it's had on music and look at the whole record phenomenon when that started 100 years ago, roughly, and how live musicians probably thought, oh no one's going to have any interest in coming and hearing us play anymore. They can just buy recorded music. You know, there's probably a lot of similarities. Just like if you read the reviews of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring in the early 1900s and then read reviews of, you know, pick any album that was, you know, probably trashed by critics, The Wall, let's say, or something like that, and that ultimately has stood the test of time and become such a monumental statement in people's lives. So the internet is one of those moments where just the manner of selling music changed entirely, but it still has as profound an effect on people's lives no matter what. How you get your music is really doesn't change the fact that it influences and changes your life, changes your thoughts, changes your whole spirit once you've engaged with it. So I think. Well, for example, I think one of the greatest, one of the most beautiful things that happened with the internet is that although it may have damaged the major label control of music around the world, it's opened music up to the entire world. In the 1980s, when I had my biggest records come out, not being able to achieve a worldwide release was an impediment in a lot of ways. Well, that doesn't exist now. You and I could make a demo song right here in the next couple of minutes, and it can have a worldwide release within the next minute. You know, so that's a monumental change in how accessible music is. But what I think it's done, and one of the most strongest impacts that I've witnessed in my life with it is that over the last 10 years, I've noticed the audience getting younger and younger for the concerts that we play, either with Styx or with Gowan. And I think the internet is largely responsible for that. Classic rock radio, obviously, and championing the cause and continuing to. But the fact that when almost like brand names, if someone wants to look up what Led Zeppelin or what Styx or what Genesis or Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer or what they sounded like in the 70s, or Queen, these bands that they've heard of, because they're huge brand names almost, that have stood the test of decades, they can instantly access that music and go, oh man, I'd love to go and see The Who. Oh, they are playing. They are playing, they're still on tour, and I can go and hear some of these songs live. And when they see it live has now become the only thing that can't be downloaded. You can have YouTube clips of a concert, but there's nothing like the visceral experience of being in an arena when a live rock show is happening. It's the greatest form of entertainment that I've experienced in my life. And it's ageless. It's been proven now, because as the audience gets younger and younger and know the lyrics to all these songs, I think the internet is largely responsible for making that instantly accessible to them. And once they see it in the live arena, they become galvanized to it, and it has as strong an influence and an overwhelming experience in their lives as it did in mine. A band to eclipse the mainstream, like in the manner, say, that the Beatles did. I don't know. I think one day it's going to happen, but it might not be rock music that they're playing in order to do that. I think that the closest to that would be the phenomenon of someone like Eminem, doing rap music. But as I listen to more and more of his best songs, there's lots of rock in there too. Of course, there can be other prolific hard rock bands. I think there are more than people may or may not be aware of. I think that Radiohead, for example, in the '90s, had just as strong an influence on music as any band in any decade. I think that they really expanded what rock could be, but very, very heavily influenced from its past as well. So we're drawing from the past of rock because it's so rich with great little elements and little movements within it. Micro movements that can be kind of brought forward and modernized. And I would give examples of bands like Muse, who do gigantic concerts around the world, and there's a band that's only been around really in the last 10 years. And when you look at the audiences at their shows, they don't look a hell of a lot different than audiences at Pink Floyd shows in the 80s, or Yes or Elton John shows in the 70s, or, you know, Hendrix shows in the 60s, or Elvis shows in the 50s, you know. So there's one band. I think you were talking about a very blues-based band that I think is really strong right now. It's only two guys, is Royal Blood. And they're very classic rock influenced, but very much with a blues underpinning there. Another great band I've heard recently out of Australia is Tame Impala, and they're very progressive rock influenced, I think, but at the same time they have their own new twist on things that I'm currently finding really entertaining. There was a band that's been around for a few years now called Keen that I thought was really, really strong. A lot of influences from I'd say there's some Elton in there, and there's some Queen influence in there, and so I think a lot of the best new bands draw heavily from the past and don't try to hide the fact. They find new ways and nuances from the past that they can exploit and bring forward and make sound modern.
How would you personally define classic rock? What is it to you?
Well, it's a certain period of time where the music, basically, like you said, was blues-based. If you want to talk about actual grammatic elements of the music, it just evolved all the time. So we have to actually talk about an era, and it's late 50s into the late 60s and the early 70s is what I would call that era of classic rock. You know, there are some groups after that, like I was mentioning to Fleetwood Mac and a few other groups that existed after that performed pretty much what we consider classic rock. But from that point on, any group that does what you might term classic rock, they're being basically retro in their approach, and they know what they're doing, and they know what their music actually sounds like, and it's referring to a past style of music.
What is rockabilly exactly?
Rockabilly was more or less self-taught guys that were coming out of like the mountains and the back country and stuff, wanting to do rock and roll, and it was a little more raw, and had a lot of energy. It was wonderful, and that's the thing that happened to classic rock in general. What we now look back on as that era of classic rock, it became more and more sophisticated, and it kind of unspooled because it became so sophisticated that it sort of killed the passion and the energy and all that rawness that started it in the first place. I wouldn't have thought that anyone would look at 90s bands at all as classic rock, but when you look at some of them, you realize that they are heavily influenced by that, and they reach back into that vault when they want to come up with something that sounds, that has that same kind of feeling.
So there are a lot of classic rock stations, both in Canada and the US, that have been recently rebranding. What do you think is the current condition of classic rock?
I think it's still healthy. A year ago May, when Q107 made that change and they started playing in the 90s and 2000s and stuff like that, a lot of people sort of freaked out. And there was a Canadian Music Week, it's a conference they do every year here. And in May, Fred Jacobs was here, and Fred's like one of the pioneers of classic rock. And I asked him, I said, do you think classic rock is dead? Is this like Q107's made this move? Why would they do something like that? This is their format. And he says, it maybe has run its course. So then a year later, this year, I asked Fred Jacobs the same question. And he says, no, classic rock's fine. I think there was maybe that time period, a year or so ago, then people started going, okay, is it dead? Is it over? But like everything, it evolves. How far do you want to evolve? I still think that a true classic rock can do well. I guess you go back to the psychedelic Sundays that Q107 does. It's 65 to 75, and that was sort of that time period that, to me, that's where the real classic rock. That's where the Led Zeppelins, the Pink Floyds, Rolling Stones, Beatles. You got to play the Black Dog and stuff like that, but you got to play the Ramble On too. You got to go find those album tracks that everybody knows, because if you bought those Zeppelin records, you know every song on the album. So, you don't have to play the hits. You can play spice in those great album tracks, because there's so many. And the other great thing about the classic rock format is that everybody knew all those songs. It's not like, you knew the singles, you knew the albums. So you could dip into all those great album tracks, and that's what, to me, what gives the format that, you need that little extra spice, that one, oh wow, I haven't heard that one for a while. You need those. Back in the 80s, I guess, when, Bon Jovi and Def Leppard and stuff like that, they're good rock bands, but, and they're sort of considered classic rock now, but there's no way that they, to me, rival Led Zeppelin or Pink Floyd or, Rolling Stones, that kind of band. They were a whole other type of rock. And then, one of the closest, I guess, ever for me was like Pearl Jam. Pearl Jam was a band that seemed to really get the double guitars, lead vocal, bass drums, and just, rock off a solo whenever they wanted. It was like, okay, that goes back to the 60s, like they could do it. But there's very few bands that, to me, have sort of done that, that have that real classic sound and sort of sound today too.
What do you enjoy about classic rock music?
To me, again, it was that time period where, I was like 15 in 1970. So, when you're 15, 16, you're in high school and music's one of your main things. You grew up with those albums, and, all of a sudden, Who's Next comes out, or Led Zeppelin 4 comes out, and you run down at Sam the Record Man, and you pick it up and you take it home, and you got all your buddies. And I remember when I first heard Zeppelin 4, was a neighbor who said, I just got it. And there was like 3 or 4 of us. So I'll go down his basement. He's got a pool table. We're shooting pool, listening to Zeppelin 4. And I still remember when Bonham did rock and roll. And it's like, oh, another drum solo. It's like, the excitement of when those records came out was amazing. Here at Boom, we do Turntable Tuesdays. We play a bunch of vinyl every Tuesday, and we're out, checking the lawn sales and stuff like that, picking up the old ones, and it really is. I'm back. I'm buying all my favorite vinyl now. I just got like the Allman Brothers left, the Fillmore East. There's like a 4 record set for like $100. It's one of my favorite albums of all time, and I didn't care if it was $100. I wanted it, and I think people are doing that again. It's like, and the quality of the vinyl is so much better now, and it just sounds really good. So I think, yeah, definitely people are going back, and especially those albums that you grew up with, and everyone's got those ones that, they maybe didn't mean that much to anybody else, but to you, it was one of those records you have to have.
Hey, thanks for watching. My name is Daniel Sarkisian. I'm an independent filmmaker from Toronto.